When we last saw this mower, it was on the table being cleaned and adjusted, but unfortunately we ran out of time before we could finish it. However, that's not going to happen this time. But just because we were able to get the mower to start and the blades working again, it doesn't mean it's all sunshine and rainbows. In fact, it's more like storm clouds and tornadoes, and that's because even though this mower may look a whole lot better, looks can be very deceiving. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Honda lawnmower, and the problem is that the blades wouldn't engage, and on top of all that, the engine's a lot louder than it's supposed to be. In the last video on this mower, we found out some very disturbing facts about it, and to be quite honest, it pains me to know that it was not well treated, but then again, it wasn't mine to begin with, and it was their choice to treat it that way. Now, I'm going to try and repair this mower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, typically, you'd want to check your oil on your mower each and every time you use it, but most of us will never do it this way. And unfortunately, this mower was ran with little to no oil in it for some time, and we're trying to figure out what kind of effect it has on the engine. Of course, if you hadn't guessed it by now, the effects of running an engine this way is not good, and that's why we need to check the oil as often as humanly possible. Before I go on, I do want to start up the engine and let you hear the sound it's making. It's a really interesting sound, and maybe you can already guess what's going on here. So as you can hear, it sounds terrible, and to be honest, I'd never buy anything that sounds this bad. Now, my first thought was that the ignition coil was hitting the flywheel, and after looking at it, it would seem to be the case. You can clearly see some marks on the side of the flywheel that shouldn't be there, along with some discoloration on the coil, so I felt confident that this was the source of the noise we're hearing. Now, my plan was to reset the air gap so that it wasn't making contact anymore, and then I would check on the health of the engine, considering it was ran with little to no oil in it. If you're not aware of it, running an engine this way could damage the piston rings and every single bearing in it. That's the reason why it's so important we check on the oil level. So here's where things get a bit interesting, at least for me. After setting the air gap and checking the clearance, we then did a compression test, and the results were very insightful. Now, from the reading on the gauge, come to find out the engine is still very healthy. You'd think that having been ran with little to no oil in it would have damaged the rings, but that's not the case. So does that mean this engine was spared from serious damage then? Unfortunately, from the noise it's making, I don't think so. Before I go on, I do want to address one maintenance item that seems to only happen to Honda mowers, which is a sticking recoil. I'm not sure why, but of all the mowers I've ever worked on, this particular recoil likes to get dirty, and if not cleaned once in a great while, it will start to have issues. Now, to clean it, I'm going to spray brake cleaner where the spring is at, but I don't want to destroy the sticker on the other side, so I'll line it up and then turn it upside down to spray it. Now, you can do this as many times as you like, but you should notice an immediate difference after the first time. After that, I'll simply work the recoil for a few seconds, at which point you'll notice the cleaner being thrown from the pulley and the spring. By the end of the process, you'll notice that the rope will now completely retract back into the pulley, unlike before. You can spray a thin lube into the spring area if you want to, but it's not necessary. I will say one thing about this method, it sure beats taking it apart and cleaning the spring by hand and then rewinding it. I do want to do one extra thing, which is to drain some of the fuel out of the tank. The reason why is because I want to make sure what's in there isn't somehow causing any of the engine's running issues. Now, to drain it, I'll just use a gravity siphon. It's nothing special. I just use my chemical bottle to start the process and then let it flow until air gets into the hose. However, I didn't have to drain it for very long because what I'm seeing coming through the hose doesn't look very concerning in any way. Now, what I'm looking for is whether or not there's any water in the fuel or if it's stale, but it turns out it's very fresh. Of course, I'm not just going to throw away this fuel. Instead, I'll put it back into the tank and move on to the next part. So my first thought when they told me it was having a blade engagement issue was that the clutch had failed, but there's just one major problem. Aside from having a bearing fail causing the engine to stall when engaging the blades, this system from Honda is very durable. The only time when the blades won't engage is when the cable breaks, which I've never seen happen either. The next thing to do would be to take the entire clutch assembly apart and find out if any one part of it has an issue. Now, if you've never done this before, it might look a little daunting, but to be honest, it's not as bad as it looks. After taking the bolt out and then removing the rest of the clutch, I'll then carefully disconnect the spring and slide out the upper part. After disconnecting the end of the cable, we should be able to slide out the upper part from the shaft, and hopefully we find some good news. All we need to do is figure out if the bearing in this part is spinning without any issues. It should spin smoothly with light resistance and without making any noise, which is exactly the case here. We'll then make sure that the bearing in the other part is behaving in the same way, which luckily it is. That means, as far as I can tell, the bearings are not the issue. Along with the other parts of the assembly, I see nothing wrong with anything, so what gives? So if there was an issue with any one of the components in the clutch, I think there might be an issue, but because I don't see any issues with anything, I don't think the clutch is the problem. So if there's nothing wrong with the clutch, then why is it behaving the way that it is then? So my best guess as to what's going on here is that when the engine had almost no oil in it, it was barely able to run, but as soon as the blades were engaged, that's when the problem would appear. Now once I realized that there was hardly any oil in the engine, I had to put more into it, and once I did that, the problem went away, so I wasn't able to see the issue firsthand. Now as far as I can tell, after having adjusted the ignition coil and put the correct amount of oil back into the engine, we should be able to start this engine and everything should be right as rain. So I am going to test that idea here in a bit once I get the clutch and the blades back on the mower. I also want to lube two important areas on this mower, which are the drive axles where they go through the bushings. And if you don't lubricate these areas, you run the risk of having them rust together, and this will cause your mower to not be able to roll backwards and your self-propel not to work either. And if that does happen, fixing the issue is a real pain, and if you don't think so, well, give it a try. Now you can use whatever lube you have on hand, and depending upon how bad it is in this area, I might use lithium grease, or if it's really bad, I'll use something a bit lighter that'll flow into the bushing better. Now don't be shy with it and spray as much as you like, because once you see what the alternative is, you'd gladly spray the whole can there too. Now since this mower has a clutch on it, I'm going to leave it on the table when I try and start it, but please be careful if you choose to do it this way. Okay, that was not a good start, and it wasn't very promising either. Unfortunately, it sounds as though the noise is still there, and now I have to wonder if somehow the blades and the clutch are involved. Now on this particular style of mower, I can take the blades off and still be able to start the engine, but yours may not be that way. So I'll just take the blades off and then start it and find out if it makes any difference to the noise. Well, this is not what I wanted to see or hear. The noise is still there, and I think I know why. Now for this next part, I'm going to need to remove the spark plug, that way I can rotate the engine easily so I can find out if the crankshaft might be bent. Once the plug is out of the engine, I'll then carefully tilt the mower back and then spin the engine while looking at the bolt in the crankshaft. Now the bolt should spin in one spot and you shouldn't be able to see it wobble. However, as we spin this one, you can see what's happening here. Now to help out visually, I'm going to put a line across the screen and this will give you a reference point. And what you're going to see is that the bolt is either going to be touching the line or not touching it, meaning that the bolt is wobbling around and that the crankshaft is bent. Well, the only way I know how is when you hit something that's hard with the blades while mowing, and unfortunately with multiple users for this mower, there's no way to get a definitive answer. So unfortunately, things are not good for this mower. It would seem that the crankshaft is bent from either hitting something it shouldn't have, or it could have warped from the heat because there was little to no oil in the engine for a long time. Now, why would I say that? Well, the reason why is because when I was sharpening the blades, I didn't find any marks from it from a severe hit. That, and of course, I wasn't able to get a definitive answer from anyone using it about hitting something with it. Either way, a simple oil change once a year, if not just checking on the oil even irregularly, would have kept this from happening, at least from all the data I've gathered. So the oil you just saw was mostly what I put in there from the last video. There was originally almost no oil in the engine. It was basically just sludge. So here's the takeaway from this video. Check the oil at least once a season, or more often if you know there's an issue with oil consumption. Of course, you should always check the oil each and every time you use your mower, but I'll take whatever I can get, and if once a year is all you got, then it's better than nothing. It's just a real shame what happened to this engine. It could have lasted a lot longer with better care, but at least it lasted this long with almost no care or sporadic care. Now, I have offered to replace the crankshaft on this engine, but the parts and the job are not cheap, but I guess all that money and time you saved from not taking care of it is now going to be put back into it. But is this mower really worth all that time and money just to replace the crankshaft, or would it be better to just replace the entire engine instead? Well, that depends on the person who owns this mower, but for me, any money I invest into my Honda mower, I happen to think is worth it. But then again, I am a bit biased towards this brand, so you may not want to listen to my opinion. So my question is, what do you think I should do with this engine? Should I rebuild it, or do you think once I get in there that there's going to be more damage than expected and it won't be worth it? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.